In ancient China, concubines were women who were kept by wealthy men as their secondary wives or mistresses. Despite being a common practice, the life of a concubine was far from glamorous or desirable. In fact, it was often characterized by extreme oppression, cruelty, and misery. Concubines had no rights, and their lives were entirely controlled by their owners. They were often forced into the role of a concubine against their will, either by their families or by being purchased as slaves. Once in this position, they were subjected to a life of servitude, and they were completely at the mercy of their owners. The treatment of concubines in ancient China was inhumane. They were often physically abused, sexually exploited, and emotionally tortured. They had no say in their own lives and were completely dependent on their owners for their survival. Despite their horrific living conditions, concubines were still coveted by men of high status, and their children often had the potential to inherit great wealth and power. This led to a vicious cycle of exploitation and oppression, which lasted for centuries. Introduction to concubinage in ancient China. Concubinage was a prevalent practice in ancient China, which refers to the practice of a man taking a woman as a secondary wife, in addition to his primary wife. Concubines held a lower social status than the primary wife, but had more rights than a mistress or a courtesan. Concubines were typically women from lower social classes who were either purchased or given as gifts to a man by their parents. They were expected to provide companionship and sexual pleasure to their master and could give birth to children who would be recognized as legitimate heirs. While the practice of concubinage was not legally recognized, it was socially accepted and even encouraged among the wealthy and powerful in ancient China. Emperors, nobles, and high-ranking officials often had large numbers of concubines and would engage in fierce competition to acquire the most beautiful and talented women. Concubinage remained a prevalent practice in China until the early 20th century when it was officially outlawed. Despite its prohibition, some remnants of concubinage still exist in modern-day China, particularly in rural areas where traditional customs and values continue to be upheld. The selection process and treatment of concubines. The practice of concubinage, which refers to the keeping of a woman who is not a man's wife, but who is granted a certain status and rights within a household, has been a part of many cultures throughout history. In some societies, concubines were chosen through a selection process and treated with respect and dignity, while in others they were treated as little more than slaves. In this article, we will explore the selection process and treatment of concubines in various cultures throughout history. In some cultures, the selection of concubines was a highly regulated and formal process. In imperial China, for example, the emperor's concubines were chosen through a rigorous selection process that involved a search throughout the empire for the most beautiful and intelligent young women. These women were then brought to the palace, where they were trained in the arts of music, dance, and literature. After several years of training, the emperor would choose the most promising of these women to become his concubines. The treatment of concubines varied widely across cultures and time periods. In some societies, concubines were treated with respect and dignity, while in others they were treated as little more than slaves. Life inside the harem. The concept of a harem refers to a private living quarters of a ruler or wealthy individual where a collection of women live. In the context of history, harems were most commonly associated with the Ottoman Empire, where they served as a symbol of power and luxury. Life inside the harem was vastly different from life outside its walls. Women who were chosen to live in the harem were often selected for their beauty and talents, such as singing, dancing, or playing musical instruments. They were trained in the arts, etiquette, and other skills to entertain and serve the ruler and his court. However, life inside the harem was also marked by isolation and confinement. Women in the harem were often forbidden from leaving its walls without permission, and their contact with the outside world was heavily restricted. They lived in a hierarchical society, with the most senior wives or concubines holding the most power and influence over the others. Despite the opulence and luxury of life inside the harem, it was not a life of freedom or autonomy. Women in the harem were essentially property of the ruler, and their fate was determined by his whims and desires. Today, the concept of a harem is largely relegated to history books and popular culture. While the idea of a luxurious and glamorous lifestyle may be appealing, It is important to recognize the inherent inequality and lack of agency that characterized life inside the harem. The consequences of failing to bear a son. The idea of a son as a source of pride and legacy is deeply ingrained in many cultures around the world. In some societies, failing to bear a son can have serious consequences for a woman and her family. Let's explore some of the potential outcomes of not having a son. Firstly, in patriarchal societies, a son is often viewed as the only legitimate heir to the family's wealth and property. Without a son, a family's lineage and inheritance may be at risk. This can lead to a great deal of pressure on a woman to produce a male child and can result in her being stigmatized or ostracized if she fails to do so. Secondly, in some cultures, the birth of a daughter is seen as a burden, and a woman who fails to bear a son may be blamed for not fulfilling her duty to her family. This can lead to a range of negative consequences, including emotional abuse, physical violence, and even abandonment. Thirdly, in some communities, the birth of a daughter is seen as a sign of bad luck or a curse. This can result in a woman and her family being shunned by their community, leading to social isolation and economic hardship. Fourthly, failing to bear a son can also lead to a woman being unable to secure a suitable marriage partner. In many cultures, the birth of a son is seen as a prerequisite for a woman to be considered a suitable wife. The legacy of concubinage in modern China. Concubinage was a traditional practice in China that allowed wealthy men to have multiple wives and concubines. Although the practice was officially abolished in 1949 after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, its legacy continues to impact modern China. In traditional Chinese society, men were allowed to have multiple wives and concubines. Concubines were women who were not legally married to their partners, but lived with them and had children. While the practice was common among wealthy men, it was also present among the middle and lower classes. Despite the abolition of concubinage, its legacy continues to affect modern China. One of the most significant impacts is on gender inequality. The practice reinforced the idea that men were superior to women, and women were seen as objects to be possessed by men. Even today, the legacy of concubinage is evident in the persistence of gender-based violence and discrimination. In conclusion, the life of concubines in ancient China was undeniably terrible, filled with a plethora of physical, emotional, and social challenges. These women were forced to sacrifice their autonomy and submit to the will of their masters, enduring a life of exploitation and abuse. However, it is important to remember that the plight of concubines was not unique to ancient China, but a reflection of a broader patriarchal culture that has historically oppressed women. It is only through continued education and awareness that we can work towards creating a more equitable and just society, one where women are valued for their contributions and afforded the same rights and opportunities as men. So that's it for today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell button to get all the latest updates.